We're going to do one of the contemplations which we have learned, and without me saying them, and you choosing which one you like. And I'll just remind you which ones they were. The first one was a loving kindness contemplation, to be free of enmity, hurtfulness, of troubles of mind and body, and to be able to protect one's own happiness and wishing the same for others. And as you can always do in a contemplation, you can choose one of those sentences, one of those ideas. You can use all of them. You can use two of them, whichever you like. Whichever you feel is most relevant to your inner life. Which one is really meaningful? If the mind says, I never have any enmity, well, then you have very little chance of contemplating upon it. If the mind says, yes, this is something that's bothering me, well, then the contemplation may be very fruitful. And then the other one, the 5 daily recollections, which is decay, disease, and death. All that is mindy and delightful will change and vanish, and one's own karma making. I pick one, use all, whichever. Whichever you think may be most fruitful to help with your own purification, your own inner happiness, your own smooth and harmonious passage through life. Choose the one that has the most meaning for you, and then look at it. And if you remember, we had an example yesterday in one of the questions. Was it yesterday or the day before? Can't remember. How contemplation is really done. It's an inner investigation, trying to stay with the subject, but getting an answer means a new question. It's an investigation into one's inner life. And it's an essential aspect of one's daily living. Most people do it sometimes anyway, without calling it contemplation. If they run up against a great deal of aggression, or they get very upset, or very anxious, very fearful, they do start looking inside and thinking, what is it? What's going on here? If one has any kind of insight, one realizes that it's happening within oneself. If one has no insight whatsoever, one thinks it's happening outside of oneself, and one has to respond in that way. This is an extreme. Not so many people are totally on that extreme if they are interested in meditation. Those that are not interested in meditation would be more apt to go to that extreme. Just be careful of that extreme. Look at it. Are you thinking it's someone else that's making you do something? It's that simple as that. Someone else, or a situation, or the circumstances. Is there anything that you think is making you do what you don't like doing? It's a very important question. So this investigation, we don't have to wait for anything unpleasant to happen. We don't have to wait until somebody becomes aggressive or starts abusing us, or we don't get at all what we want. We can do it now. And the more intensive we get to do it, the more pertinent the answers are, the smoother it will be to live. The less ego, the more joy. Very simple, isn't it? but not easy to do. The simplicity of the teaching is one of its great advantages. It's so simple to understand, but it's not easy to do. But for that reason, we need to have that inner investigation, and we will find new answers if we do it properly. We will always find a new sort of opening which shows us something which we haven't seen before. This, even if that, what we see, is not exactly what we want to see. It may not be a support system for our belief in our own goodness. It's still an occasion for joy. Whatever we see, whatever we learn, it's enriching for us, so we can be happy about it. If we start blaming ourselves, then of course it's not enriching, then it's debilitating. So we have to be careful. A spiritual path is a path of the middle way, no extremes. We have to a balancing act of understanding, investigation, interrogation, understanding, and no blame. And as long as we blame ourselves for anything, it's just as detrimental to the well-being of ourselves and others as if we were blaming someone else. Whoever we blame, it doesn't make anything work better. On the contrary, if we have found a negativity within us and then add blame to it, we've got two negativities. That's totally unnecessary. One is plenty. And we should always remember that. One negativity is enough. Just look at it and see it, and that's fine. So we're going to do this on our own, in any which way you can do it. If the mind wanders off to future wishes and hopes or past remembrances, bring it back. Let the past be where it belongs, in the past. And let the future be where it belongs, in the future, where it never happens. Just come back to this moment. This is a wonderful moment, if we stay in it. As long as we think about what we want to get out of it, it's no longer wonderful. It becomes very stressful. Because I want to get something out of it, it's very stressful. But as long as I'm in it, it's wonderful. And that's a whole difference between being concentrated and discursive thinking. This is the one moment I can live in, and I can make it absolutely wonderful, not by fantasizing, by being with that one moment. I cannot recommend it enough. Try it over and over again. The human mind is geared towards doing the opposite, running all over the place, thinking of what it's going to do with what it's doing now. It's doing something now, it's meditating or contemplating. So that's going to be wonderful, going to show it to other people, or going to use it for one's profession, or going to talk about it at the next meeting or whatever. It's not useful. Now, this minute. And that's really then a totally different experience. Always to start out, you can put the attention on the breath for just a moment, and then extend some loving kindness to yourself, And then choose the one of the contemplations which you feel most inclined towards. People often ask whether Buddhism is a religion, and then they go on to say, well, or is it a philosophy, or what is it? Well, naturally it's a religion. It's one of the 5 great world religions, and it's a state religion in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka. It used to be in state religion in Tibet and also in Cambodia. And it has approximately 500 million people that are saying they're Buddhist. That's a religion they were either born into or the religion that they adopted. Most of them were born into it. But what we understand about religion is not quite what the Buddha had in mind. And I have an inkling that most of the religion founders didn't quite have in mind what people are doing with it. I think it's a fair assumption. We have a very fortunate situation that not only can we go back to the original words of the Buddha, there are 17,500 discourses, and they're available. All of them have been translated into English. Some of them, the English is a bit antiquated, but it's English, so we can read it. We don't even have to learn a foreign language. They were originally written down in Pali. Pali is a derivative of Sanskrit. It's the language the Buddha is supposed to have spoken. It doesn't have an alphabet. The alphabet that was used was Sinhalese, the Ceylonese, the alphabet of the Sinhala language. And we also have it, of course, in Pali in our Roman letters. So we have a very fortunate situation there, going back to the original words, which isn't good enough yet either. Certainly it contains philosophical aspects. Why not? How could it help it? Anything we talk about which isn't exactly only about the weather would have some philosophical aspect to it. It contains psychology. Of course it does. Anything that has to do with the behavior of people has to contain psychology. And religion always has to do with the behavior of people. So we certainly have those 3 aspects. But the main purpose and the main content of the Buddha's teaching is a practice path. A path, an instruction, what to do and how to do it, and for what purpose. Whether we then consider it philosophy, psychology, or religion doesn't really matter. Because if we do practice for the purpose indicated by the Buddha, we know at the end what religion really means. And we also don't have to ask, because then we have it within. the practice path containing the guidelines of the Buddha is in short form enumerated in the Noble Eightfold Path, and shorter yet in the 3 words which I have already used several times: purification, concentration, and wisdom. The whole of the teaching is divided into those 3, contains those 3, explains them from every possible angle, over and over again. The Noble Eightfold Path contains those 3, doesn't explain them, just gives instruction what to do. Should we just like to see what the Buddha said, think maybe it's very interesting, but not do it, there's no way we can understand it. None whatsoever. This is a misconception that is happening over and over again. Just because we know the language that we're reading, whichever one that may be, and just because we know the words doesn't mean we understand. It just means that we have a superficial information which we probably forget as quickly as we've taken it in. But what we practice and then experience, we don't forget. There's no way we can forget it, because it becomes second nature. And this is actually what we're trying to do, have second nature. The first one wasn't all that satisfactory. We'll get a second one. And all of the guidance and the instructions which we can find let this one it says goes ahead.
You can close the windows. You can close the windows.
That one. Instructions or the guidelines that I have mentioned here, each one is for practice. But also it's interesting to know, at least on an informative level, what's the purpose of it all. Certainly the purpose is to have more peace and joy in the heart, but that is only an intermediate step. It works, but it's not the entire goal. The purpose of any practice that we do, and I should like to mention that that is the purpose of any spiritual practice, whether it's being explained or not, is to get rid of the illusion of a separate self. That's the purpose of the practice. That is a feeling and not an intellectual understanding. So we have to do every step on the way, particularly particularly because the illusion of the separate self is so deeply embedded that while we may understand that intellectually and agree with it, and even that's not that easy, people often find that difficult. But even if we have gone past that first hurdle and agree with it and don't mind the idea that there's no separate self, it's so deeply embedded that we really have to dig out the roots with which it has made its home within our heart and mind. Those roots are like tap roots. We can't just pull a little and then that whole edifice will come out. It's quite a deep and intensive practice. And that's why if we really want to meditate, if that's an idea we have in mind, I would like to meditate, we can't do it on its own. It's got to have all the other things which we're talking about as support systems. The stronger the ego illusion is, the less we'll meditate. The ego is in the way. It wants to think, it wants to discuss, it wants to fantasize, to plan, to hope, and mainly it wants to have support. It wants to know that it is in existence and in existence as somebody special. The more of that we have within, the less we can meditate. Now that's also not a cause for sorrow, but it's a cause for investigation. If we really investigate our distractions and inquire into them, we will find invariably it's me distracting. That's all it can be. What else? So we need to keep in mind actually what the purpose of the whole exercise is. The purpose of the exercise is to find out that we're living in an illusion. We're living with something which is creating havoc. The personality belief, the separate identity, creates havoc in the world. It sets brother against brother, nation against nation, children against parents. Nothing else can do it except that personality belief, the separate identity. If we can make that clear to ourselves, and people who have practiced some and have seen their own dukkha, and again the hate characters have it much easier there, know it. They know it for a fact. It's something which is obvious. But again, what's so obvious and what we know, we still can't do. Again, no cause for sorrow, but it should be a cause for what is called in Pali samvega, urgency. Let's get on with it. Let's do it now. There is no other time except now. This is also another human fallacy to think, well, there's plenty of time, do it some other time. And all of a sudden one finds there is no other time. This is the time to do it. we have already spoken about one of the important facets of the teaching, mindfulness, and I like to come back to it once more, because there is an aspect to it which also needs to be discussed and known. And to repeat and recapitulate, mindfulness is knowing only. It's being attentive to oneself, to recognizing what's going within. Contemplation helps, meditation helps. There are 4 foundations that we can use. 1 is body, 3 are mind. I've already mentioned what we do with body mindfulness, just as a reminder. Outside of meditation, body mindfulness. Obviously, it's also being careful and having regard for others, because if we're mindful, we don't slam doors, and we don't disturb anyone because we are trying to be careful. So we have regard for others. But it's far more than that. Mindfulness of the body, as I mentioned, is purification, because we are really focused on something which cannot create hate or greed. We are in the moment. We're learning to be here now. And with that, we also can become aware of the fact, which is the very first insight. The first insight which leads to total liberation. Namely, when we watch the body, what it's doing, we cannot help but become aware of the fact that the mind is telling it to do it. That there are 2, mind and body, and that mind is the master and body is the servant. And while sometimes, if there is some sickness or other inability in the body, the mind might tell the body something and it can't do it. Well, that happens with all servants. So this particular understanding has to be embedded completely and utterly, because otherwise we'll forget, why did we want to meditate? Why should I meditate? It's very uncomfortable. I don't really want to do it. While we're here, you're being reminded. Out there, you're going to be reminded of innumerable other things, quite different from meditating. But if we are completely clear that mind is the master and body is the servant, then we have at least a handle on it. Everything else is fantasy. Just watch it. Could your body ever have appeared here, in this meditation hall, in Germany, if your mind hadn't said, now come on, let's go there? And then the mind might even have said, oh, it's so far. And then the mind said, well, it's all right. I want to see Germany anyway. And then the mind said, oh, it's so expensive. And I said, it's all right, I have a little bit saved. So it's been discussing it. And finally, it's been quite clear. Okay, let's go. So then the body appeared. Don't have to go any further than that. But, so that's easily forgotten. walking, sitting, standing, putting one's clothes on, going to the toilet, whatever it may be, the mind is in charge. And the mind is in charge of whatever we do. It also reacts to the body, of course. And sometimes it reacts very unfortunately. Well, we can watch that. It's a first step into insight, knowing that there are two which are interacting, depend upon each other, but there's one which is the boss of the whole situation. Now we are, of course, quite able to look after the body, most people are, and we should, because if we don't look after a servant, it's not a very loving situation, and also could cause quite a lot of trouble. But if we constantly only look after the servant and forget that there is a boss also, a master, and take him, her for granted, what kind of an outfit do we have? One where only the servant is important and does what it likes. And the boss has to react to that. So that's not a very wonderful situation. So if we can remember that, we might remember why we're meditating. We're meditating in order to strengthen the one who's in charge. We're meditating in order to bring peace to the one who's in charge. We're meditating to bring strength and some clarity, because only what's clear in our own minds is what we can do. Everything else, other people do. What we can do has got to be clear to us. So mindfulness of the body brings that with it as a first step. But please don't take my words for granted and say, oh yes, that's the way it is. Or doubt them and say, no, that's not the way it is. Try it out yourself. Become aware of it. It's so simple. You sit on the pillow and the mind says, oh yes, it's time to get up. Now try it. Let the mind say, no, I'm going to sit here. What are you going to do? Of course, the last instruction is the one the body has to obey. So then you say, oh well, that's silly, let's get up. So then get up. There's no other way we can do it. But please, do it yourself. The Buddha didn't want anyone to believe anything. But of course he didn't also appreciate disbelief, which is skeptical doubt. But what he appreciated very much was people trying it out and seeing for themselves. And when we find out who's in charge of all this, all our mind moments will become far more careful of them. And we become more careful also about the karma we make in the mind. So the whole thing works together, and we can see how it operates in a human being. Now this mindfulness of the body, in the meditation we have discussed, outside of meditation, as much as you can remember to do it, because it also prepares one to sit down in peace. The second one, the mindfulness of our feelings, which is feelings and emotions. We did that yesterday with the part-by-part meditation technique. But of course, it also enters into the understanding and the labeling, the content of mind, which is number 4. Now there's number 3, which I haven't mentioned yet. And number 3 is a little harder to become aware of. It's a more subtle